Have you ever had one of those revelations that flips your world upside down? The kind that makes you doubt everything you've ever believed in, leaving you to wonder, how did this happen? I never thought I would experience something like that. A seemingly insignificant detail, something so small, turned out to have the power to shatter trust and completely change how I saw my family. Now imagine discovering that the child you raised and loved isn't biologically yours. It's a shock no one is prepared to face. This isn't just about genetics. It's about identity, relationships, loyalty, love, or the lack of it. The pain of being betrayed by someone you trusted the most, of realizing that the bonds you believed were unbreakable crumbled in an instant, is indescribable. And the worst part? Figuring out how to rebuild after such a devastating blow. Is the truth the key to healing or just another source of unbearable pain? Stay with me because I'm going to tell you my story. It's a truth that shook me to my core, yet it also taught me valuable lessons about trust, forgiveness, and what it truly means to be a father. If you've ever gone through something similar, or you're wondering how to cope when reality hits you like a freight train, this video might be exactly what you need to hear. Before we dive in, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications. Together, we'll navigate the journey of rebuilding, understanding family dilemmas, and making the hardest choices. Let's begin. You're probably asking yourself how someone even discovers something so devastating, how you come to know that the child you've cherished, loved, and raised isn't biologically yours. I'll tell you this, the worst part is how such a revelation can strike out of nowhere, in ways you'd never expect. The pain, the shock, the feeling that the ground has vanished beneath your feet, it was exactly like that for me. My life was, by all appearances, perfectly peaceful. I had a simple yet fulfilling routine, a wife I trusted, and a son who was my greatest joy. I thought I was living the ideal life, or at least what I thought was ideal. A beloved wife, a growing child, and a stable, well-planned life. My days were filled with work, focused on building a solid family. I trusted her implicitly. To me, our relationship was unshakable, or so I believed. We had built a life together, a partnership I thought was ironclad. Never did I suspect that subtle, invisible signs were leading me toward an unimaginable shock. It began with small things, little signs I dismissed at the time. Her phone was always locked. Her tone of voice shifted when she spoke to certain people, especially when I was around. Occasionally she seemed distant, preoccupied. I would think to myself, you're just being paranoid. After all, we had a stable relationship, right? Everyone says, if you start looking for trouble you'll find it, so I ignored those little details. I had no idea that these tiny, seemingly insignificant things were chipping away at the foundation of my trust. And then came the discovery, a moment that changed everything. It was an ordinary afternoon like any other. I came home earlier than usual and for some reason, decided to check her phone. I wasn't intending to snoop, but an indescribable feeling of unease had been growing inside me. Call it intuition, call it a gut feeling, but I couldn't ignore it anymore. What I found on her phone didn't just break my trust. It shook the very core of my identity. It made me question my role as a father, my relationship with my son, and, most painfully, my place in the family I had cherished and nurtured. It was just a message, a simple, seemingly innocuous message. But those words revealed a betrayal I never saw coming. My wife, the mother of my child, was involved with another man, a man I didn't know. The words exchanged between them weren't just about physical betrayal. They hinted at something deeper, something that would unravel the very foundation of my life. The shock was so overwhelming that I froze, unable to process what I was reading. The sense of betrayal cut deeper than anything I'd ever experienced. It felt like I was living in an alternate reality, one where everything I thought was true turned out to be a lie. The hardest part? Realizing that this wasn't just about infidelity. It was about my son, our son. The messages hinted at something far more devastating, the possibility that he wasn't mine. A secret so monumental had been hiding in plain sight, and I had missed every clue. The weight of that realization was unbearable. How could I have been so blind? How could I have believed everything was fine when the truth was lurking in the shadows? The signs had been there all along, but I hadn't given them the attention they deserved. The enormity of what I had uncovered left me grappling with questions I didn't know how to answer. Sitting there with her phone in my hands, the screen glowing like a beacon of betrayal, I felt the ground shift beneath me. My heart raced and a strange numbness took over. It was as if time had stopped, and the reality I thought I knew dissolved into nothingness. The words I read weren't just about infidelity, they were about lies woven so deeply into the fabric of my life that I could barely breathe. The messages revealed a relationship that had been hidden from me, a connection she had kept secret for years. The man wasn't just someone she knew. He was someone who shared an intimacy with her that I thought was exclusive to us. And then the devastating implication emerged. The child I had raised, loved, and cherished might not be mine. How do you even begin to process something like that? At first, I told myself it couldn't be true. It had to be a misunderstanding, a coincidence. But the more I read, the more undeniable it became. The casual tone of their conversations, the shared jokes, the way they spoke about things I wasn't a part of, it all pointed to a betrayal far deeper than I could have imagined. When she walked into the room later that evening, everything felt surreal. She greeted me with a warm smile, completely unaware of the storm brewing inside me. I could barely look at her, let alone speak. My hands trembled as I placed the phone on the table between us. "Who is he?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. She froze. The color drained from her face, and her expression shifted from confusion to panic. For a moment she didn't say anything. Then, with a shaky breath, she tried to brush it off. "What are you talking about?" she said, her voice filled with feigned innocence. But I wasn't going to let her deflect. "Don't lie to me," I said, my voice cracking under the weight of my emotions. "I read the messages. I know about him. And I know our son might not be mine." The silence that followed was deafening. Her eyes welled up with tears, but I couldn't tell if they were tears of guilt, shame, or something else entirely. She tried to explain, stammering through excuses, but the words barely registered. All I could hear was the sound of my own heart breaking. In the days that followed, I found myself replaying every moment of our life together, searching for signs I had overlooked. There were so many little things that suddenly made sense. The locked phone, the late-night calls, the moments of unexplained distance. Each memory was like a puzzle piece, coming together to form a picture I didn't want to see. I thought about the early days of our relationship, the times we laughed together, the plans we made for the future. How could she have carried this secret for so long? How could she have looked me in the eye, day after day, knowing the truth? The realization that she had been living a double life shattered everything I believed about our marriage. And then there was my son. The boy who called me Dad, who looked up to me, who relied on me. Every memory we shared, the bedtime stories, the trips to the park, the first time he rode a bike, was now tainted by doubt. Was he truly my son, or had I been living a lie all these years? I knew I couldn't move forward without answers. The uncertainty was eating me alive. So, I did what I had to do. I ordered a DNA test. The wait for the results was agonizing. Every time I looked at my son, I felt a pang of guilt and sadness. He didn't know what was happening, didn't understand why I was suddenly distant. When the envelope finally arrived, I sat alone in the living room, staring at it for what felt like hours. My hands shook as I opened it, unfolding the paper inside. The words stared back at me, cold and clinical. Probability of paternity, 0%? In that moment, the world seemed to stop. I felt a wave of emotions crash over me: anger, sadness, betrayal, and most surprisingly, love. Despite everything, I loved him. He was my son, even if he wasn't biologically mine. But how could I reconcile that love with the pain of the truth? The days and weeks that followed were some of the hardest of my life. My wife and I barely spoke. When we did, it was filled with tension and resentment. She begged for forgiveness, insisting that the affair had ended years ago and that she had been too scared to tell me the truth. But her words felt hollow. The damage had been done, and no amount of apologies could undo it. I found myself withdrawing from everyone, including my son. It wasn't his fault, I knew that. But every time I looked at him, I was reminded of the betrayal. The guilt of feeling that way was almost unbearable. He was innocent in all of this, yet he was caught in the crossfire of a battle he didn't understand. Over time, I realized that I had a choice to make. I could let this destroy me, or I could try to rebuild, not just my family but myself. I sought therapy to help process my emotions, to understand the complex feelings of anger, love, and betrayal that were tearing me apart. One day, as I watched my son play in the yard, I had a moment of clarity. He was still the same boy I had raised, the same boy I had loved from the moment he was born. The bond we shared wasn't defined by biology, it was defined by the countless moments we had spent together, by the love I had given him. As for my wife, the path to forgiveness was much harder. Trust, once broken, is almost impossible to rebuild. But I knew that if there was any chance of healing, we would both have to work for it. It wasn't easy and it didn't happen overnight. But little by little we started to pick up the pieces. Even after confirming the truth, the hardest part wasn't the betrayal itself, it was navigating my role as a father. How do you look at a child you've raised, loved, and protected, knowing he isn't biologically yours? How do you separate the love you've given from the deception that brought him into your life? These questions haunted me every day. At first, I felt a deep sense of detachment. I avoided eye contact with my son, kept my interactions with him brief, and pulled away from the routines that had once been the foundation of our bond. Bedtime stories became a chore. Family dinners were filled with awkward silences. He didn't understand why his father, the man he trusted most in the world, was suddenly so distant. And honestly, I didn't understand it either. But then there were moments that broke through the wall I had built around myself. One night, as I stood in the doorway of his room, I watched him sleep. His small chest rose and fell with every breath, his face peaceful and innocent. In that moment I realized something. No DNA test could erase the years we had spent together. He was still my son in every way that mattered. Fatherhood, I realized, is about more than biology. It's about love, sacrifice, and showing up every single day, even when it's hard. It's about being the person who teaches him right from wrong, who cheers him on at soccer games, who kisses his scraped knees and helps him with his homework. But knowing this didn't make it any easier to reconcile my feelings. There was still a part of me that felt like an imposter, like I was living someone else's life. I worried about how this truth would affect him if he ever found out. Would he resent me for not being his biological father? Would he feel like I had lied to him too? These fears consumed me, but they also pushed me to make a choice. To love him not because I had to, but because I wanted to. I chose to remain his father, not out of obligation, but because the bond we shared was real, no matter how it had started. While my relationship with my son slowly began to heal, the same couldn't be said for my marriage. The betrayal had created a chasm between us that felt impossible to bridge. My wife tried everything, counseling, open communication, even giving me space when I needed it, but I struggled to trust her again. Every time she picked up her phone, my mind raced with suspicion. Every time she left the house, I wondered where she was going and who she was seeing. It was exhausting living in a constant state of doubt. But the truth was, I wasn't ready to let her go. Despite everything, a part of me still loved her, or at least loved the idea of what we had once been. Therapy became a crucial part of our journey. We attended sessions together, where we unpacked the layers of pain and betrayal that had built up over the years. I learned that her decision to hide the truth wasn't born out of malice, but fear of losing me, of breaking apart our family. While that didn't excuse her actions, it helped me understand them. And understanding, I realized, was the first step toward forgiveness. Forgiveness isn't a single moment, it's a process. It doesn't mean erasing the pain or pretending the betrayal never happened. It means choosing every day to move forward despite the scars. For me, forgiveness began in small ways. I started to notice her efforts, how she went out of her way to be transparent, to rebuild my trust, to show me that she was still committed to our family. I began to let my guard down inch by inch. But it was far from easy. There were days when the pain felt fresh, when a single reminder of the past would send me spiraling back into anger and resentment. One of the hardest moments came during a counseling session, when the therapist asked me what I wanted from our marriage. I sat in silence for what felt like an eternity, unsure of how to answer. Did I want to save what we had, or was I holding on out of fear of starting over? Finally, I said, I want to trust her again. But I don't know if I can. Those words hung in the air, heavy with uncertainty. And yet, saying them out loud felt like a small step toward healing. As months turned into years, my family and I worked to rebuild what had been broken. It wasn't a smooth journey, there were setbacks, arguments, and moments of doubt. But there were also breakthroughs, moments of connection that reminded me why I had chosen to stay. One of those moments came during my son's school play. He was nervous about his performance, and as I watched him on stage, fumbling through his lines, I felt an overwhelming surge of pride. In that moment, nothing else mattered, not DNA, not betrayal, not the past. He was my son, and I loved him with every fiber of my being. After the play, he ran up to me, his face beaming. "Did I do okay, Dad?" he asked, his voice filled with hope. You were amazing, I said, pulling him into a hug. And I meant it. Looking back, the journey wasn't just about overcoming betrayal, it was about growth. I learned that love isn't always clean or simple. It's messy, complicated, and sometimes painful. But it's also resilient. I learned that trust can be rebuilt, but it requires patience, effort, and a willingness to be vulnerable. I learned that forgiveness doesn't mean forgetting, it means choosing to move forward even when it's hard. And I learned that fatherhood isn't defined by biology, but by the love and care you give every day. Most importantly, I learned that healing starts from within. No matter how much someone else may hurt you, the power to overcome that pain lies within yourself. It's not about erasing the past but about finding a way to live with it, and even grow from it. As I continued to navigate my journey of healing, I began to think about how all of this would affect my son. Up until now, he had been blissfully unaware of the turmoil brewing beneath the surface. But the truth loomed over me, a heavy secret I didn't know how to carry. Should I tell him? And if so, when? Oh, would he even understand? These questions plagued me, but I also knew that shielding him from the truth indefinitely wasn't an option. Children have a way of sensing when something is wrong, and he had already started asking questions. "Why are you and Mom always arguing?" he asked one evening, his wide eyes filled with worry. I didn't know how to answer. I decided to consult our therapist about how to approach this. Her advice was clear but daunting. When the time feels right, you need to be honest with him. But frame it in a way that reassures him he is loved and valued no matter what. The idea of having that conversation terrified me. How could I explain something so complicated to someone so innocent? How could I make him understand that none of this was his fault? And most of all, how could I protect him from the pain of feeling like he didn't belong? The day finally came when I couldn't put it off any longer. He was sitting at the kitchen table drawing a picture of the three of us, me, him, and his mom, smiling and holding hands. My heart ached as I watched him. How could I break this image of perfection he had in his mind? "Hey buddy," I said, sitting down beside him. "Can we talk for a minute?" He looked up at me, his little face full of curiosity. "Sure, Dad. What's up?" I took a deep breath, trying to find the right words. "You know I love you, right? More than anything in the world." He nodded, his eyes starting to show a hint of worry. "I love you too, Dad." I smiled, though my heart felt like it was breaking. "There's something I need to tell you. It's a little complicated, but I think you're old enough to understand." He listened intently as I carefully explained the situation. I told him that while I wasn't his biological father, I had loved him as my son from the moment he was born. I reassured him that this didn't change anything about how I felt about him or our relationship. When I finished, there was a long silence. He looked down at his drawing, then back up at me. "So, you're not my real dad?" he asked, his voice trembling. I placed a hand on his shoulder, my eyes meeting his. "I am your real dad. Maybe not by blood, but in every way that matters. I'm the one who taught you to ride a bike, who cheers for you at your soccer games, who tucks you in at night. Being a dad isn't about DNA. It's about love." He stared at me for a moment, then threw his arms around my neck. "You'll always be my dad," he said, his voice muffled against my shoulder. Tears streamed down my face as I held him tightly. In that moment, I realized that no secret, no betrayal, no amount of pain could ever take away the bond we shared. After that conversation, something shifted within me. I felt lighter, as if the burden I had been carrying for so long had finally been lifted. My son's acceptance of me as his father, despite everything, gave me the strength to continue rebuilding not just our relationship, but our family as a whole. My wife and I still had a long way to go. The scars of her betrayal didn't disappear overnight, and there were days when the pain felt as fresh as the moment I first discovered the truth. But slowly, through therapy and honest communication, we began to rebuild the trust that had been shattered. We made a conscious effort to create new memories as a family, ones that weren't overshadowed by the past. We took weekend trips to the beach, cooked meals together, and spent lazy Sundays watching movies. These small moments of joy reminded me of why I had chosen to stay, why I believed our family was worth fighting for. One of the unexpected challenges came from outside our home. Friends and extended family who had been unaware of the situation started asking questions. "Why do you seem so distant? Is everything okay with you and your wife?" At first, I tried to avoid these conversations, afraid of exposing our private pain. But I soon realized that part of healing meant being honest, even when it was uncomfortable. I shared the truth with a select few people I trusted, and to my surprise, their responses were overwhelmingly supportive. They reminded me that no family is perfect, and that what mattered most was our commitment to moving forward. However, not everyone was understanding. Some questioned my decision to stay with my wife or to continue raising a child who wasn't biologically mine. Their judgment stung, but it also strengthened my resolve. I knew in my heart that the choices I had made were right for me and my family, and that was all that mattered. As time went on, the pain of the past began to fade, replaced by a sense of hope for the future. My wife and I reached a place where we could laugh together again, where the weight of betrayal no longer defined our every interaction. My son continued to thrive, his love for me unwavering despite the truth we had faced together. I realized that while the journey had been one of the most painful experiences of my life, it had also been one of the most transformative. It taught me the true meaning of love, forgiveness, and resilience. It showed me that even in the face of unimaginable betrayal, there is a path forward, one that requires strength, patience, and a willingness to embrace the messy, imperfect reality of human relationships. If there's one thing I hope others can take away from my story, it's this. Life is rarely as simple as we want it to be. People make mistakes. Trust is broken. Pain is inevitable. But within that pain lies the opportunity for growth, for understanding, and for finding a deeper kind of love. Forgiveness doesn't mean forgetting, and healing doesn't mean returning to the way things were. It's about creating something new, something stronger, built on the hard-earned lessons of the past. As I look at my son now, I no longer see the shadow of betrayal. I see a boy who loves me, who trusts me, who calls me Dad with pride. And that, above all else, is what makes everything we've been through worth it. While the process of rebuilding my family was underway, I realized there was another aspect of healing I couldn't ignore: myself. The betrayal had shaken me to my core, not only as a husband and father but as a person. I had always prided myself on being someone who could handle anything, someone who had control over his life. But now, that image of myself was in pieces. I began questioning everything. Had I missed signs in other areas of my life? Was I too trusting, too naive? The doubts were relentless, and they began to seep into other relationships. Friends, colleagues, even casual acquaintances. I started second-guessing people's intentions, wondering if everyone around me was hiding something. It was exhausting. Therapy helped me understand that this wasn't just about my wife's actions. Her betrayal had triggered a deeper insecurity, one that had always been there but had never been fully acknowledged. I had tied so much of my identity to being a husband and father that when those roles were called into question, I felt like I didn't know who I was anymore. Through therapy, I began the slow work of rediscovering myself. I started journaling, writing down not just my thoughts but also my fears, my hopes, and my memories. It became a way to process the chaos in my mind. I also started prioritizing self-care, something I had neglected for years. Simple things like going for a run or spending an afternoon reading became acts of reclaiming my independence. One of the hardest lessons I learned was that vulnerability isn't a weakness. For most of my life, I had equated strength with keeping my emotions in check, with being the rock for everyone else. But now, I saw that true strength came from facing my emotions head-on, from allowing myself to feel the pain rather than burying it. There was a moment in therapy that really drove this home. My therapist asked me to describe the emotions I felt when I first discovered the truth. At first, I resisted. I didn't want to relive that moment. It was too raw, too overwhelming. But she pushed me gently, and eventually the words started pouring out. Anger, sadness, humiliation, confusion, betrayal. Saying those words out loud was like releasing a pressure valve. For so long, I had been carrying those emotions alone, afraid to admit how deeply they had affected me. But in that moment, I realized that sharing my pain didn't make me weaker. It made me human. And being human was enough. As the months turned into years, my family and I began to settle into a new rhythm. It wasn't the same as before. How could it be? But it was something new, something that worked for us. My wife and I continued to work on our relationship, focusing on communication and transparency. There were still moments of doubt, moments when old wounds resurfaced, but we had learned how to address them together. My relationship with my son also flourished. The conversation we had about his parentage turned out to be a turning point for us. He no longer had questions about where he stood in my life. He knew he was loved unconditionally. And for me, the act of choosing to be his father every day despite everything became one of the most empowering decisions I had ever made. We also made a point of involving him in our healing process in age-appropriate ways. We had family meetings where we talked openly about our feelings, allowing him to express his thoughts and fears. It wasn't always easy, but it created a sense of unity that we hadn't had before. One of the biggest challenges we faced was how to navigate the world outside our home. While the three of us had found a way to move forward, the opinions and judgments of others often felt like an additional burden. Some people admired our resilience and saw our family as a testament to the power of forgiveness. Others were less kind, questioning my decision to stay with my wife or continue raising a child who wasn't biologically mine. At first, their comments stung. I found myself wanting to defend our choices, to explain the complexity of our situation. But over time, I realized that their opinions didn't matter. What mattered was the love and commitment we had for each other. We learned to create boundaries, deciding who we would share our story with and how much we were comfortable revealing. This gave us a sense of control over our narrative and protected the progress we had made as a family. Forgiveness had been one of the hardest parts of this journey. It wasn't something I gave all at once. It was something I had to choose over and over again. There were days when resentment crept back in, when I replayed the betrayal in my mind and felt the old anger resurface. But each time I reminded myself of the progress we had made and the love we still shared. Forgiving my wife didn't mean excusing her actions. It didn't mean pretending the pain wasn't real. It meant acknowledging the hurt while also choosing to focus on the future rather than the past. It meant accepting that people make mistakes, sometimes devastating ones, but that they are still capable of change. One of the most profound lessons I learned was about the true meaning of fatherhood. Before all of this, I had never questioned what it meant to be a dad. I assumed it was tied to biology, to genetics. But now I knew better. Fatherhood wasn't about whose blood ran through my son's veins. It was about the bond we shared, the love we gave each other, and the life we built together. Every time he called me Dad, it reinforced that bond. Every time we laughed together, shared a meal, or worked through a problem, it reminded me that our relationship was just as real and meaningful as if we shared the same DNA. In many ways, it was even stronger because it was built on choice rather than circumstance. Today I can look back on this journey with a sense of peace. It wasn't easy and there were moments when I thought I wouldn't make it through. But I did. My family did. We are stronger, more honest, and more connected than we ever were before. If you're going through something similar, know this: the pain won't last forever. Healing takes time and it's not a linear process. But with patience, effort, and love, it's possible to rebuild, even after the most devastating betrayals. This story isn't just about betrayal and forgiveness. It's about resilience. It's about the power of love to overcome even the deepest wounds. And it's about the choices we make every day to create the life we want, no matter what challenges we face.